The rope knew 13 different weights before it learned Jonathan Hale's. Micah Freeman had climbed that twisted live oak 47 times in 18 months, testing knots, measuring drop distances, studying how hemp fibers frayed under sudden load. He kept a journal in his head because enslaved men weren't allowed paper. Each ascent taught him something. How green wood flexes under strain, how pulley friction generates heat, how a half-inch miscalculation transforms execution into salvation. The plantation records would later note Master Hale's death as equipment failure during a routine demonstration. But 3 generations of Micah's descendants kept a different account, whispered in kitchens and passed along at funerals. About the morning 53 people stood motionless in the August heat, while their owner strangled on his own scaffold. About the enslaved carpenter who had studied the physics of death until he understood it better than the men who wielded it. About patience measured not in days, but in the precise tensile strength of Georgia hemp. The live oak stood 200 yards south of the main house at Hale Grove Plantation, its lowest branch extending parallel to the ground at exactly 9 feet. Moss hung from its limbs like torn burial shrouds. The tree was approximately 80 years old when Jonathan Hale inherited the property in 1856, but it earned its name 3 months later when he hanged a field hand named Samuel for the crime of meeting his owner's eyes during a reprimand. Hale Grove sat on 1,100 acres of red clay soil 12 miles northwest of Columbia, South Carolina. Cotton grew there, though not as profitably as it had before the soil began giving out in the 1840s. 72 enslaved people worked the property in 1863. They lived in 2 rows of cabins built from heart pine, each structure housing between 6 and 9 people depending on family size. The quarters smelled of wood smoke and lye soap and the particular exhaustion that comes from bodies pushed past their design limits. Jonathan Hale was 34 years old, educated at South Carolina College, and convinced that slavery was not merely an economic system, but a divine mandate. He had inherited the plantation from his father, along with a philosophy he articulated frequently, that enslaved people required constant reminders of their position lest they forget the natural order. He stood 6 feet tall, wore his dark hair swept back with pomade, and possessed hands that had never performed physical labor beyond signing documents and pulling triggers. The hanging tree served a specific function in Hale's architecture of control. Unlike whippings, which were administered behind the overseer's cottage, or the stocks near the barn, the tree stood in clear view of both the main house and the quarters. Hale wanted his wife Catherine to see it from her parlor window. He wanted the field hands to pass it every morning on their way to the cotton rows. He wanted the house servants to glance at it through the kitchen door while preparing his meals. Micah Freeman was 28 years old in the spring of 1863. He had been born at Hale Grove, the son of a carpenter named Jacob and a woman named Ruth who died when Micah was 6. His hands were broad and calloused from 10 years of apprenticeship under his father, learning to read wood grain and judge joinery angles. When Jacob Freeman died of fever in 1859, Micah inherited his tools and his position as the plantation's primary carpenter. He had also inherited a wife named Hannah, 23 years old, who worked in the main house as a seamstress. They had been married in a ceremony Hale performed himself, a brief affair with no legal standing but absolute binding force within the plantation's social order. Hannah was quick-minded and careful, the kind of woman who could stitch a torn hem while listening to conversations happening 3 rooms away. She and Micah lived in the 3rd cabin from the north end of the quarters, sharing the space with 2 other families. Micah's younger brother Thomas worked the fields. He was 24, built like their father, but with their mother's face, and he possessed a dangerous quality that Micah lacked: optimism. Thomas believed things might improve. He believed the war news filtering south meant something. He believed that if you worked hard and kept quiet and avoided trouble, you might live to see better days. On March 14th, 1863, Thomas Freeman was caught with a piece of cornbread he had pocketed from the morning distribution. The overseer, a man named Virgil Chase, reported the theft to Hale. Jonathan Hale ordered Thomas brought to the hanging tree. The entire plantation was assembled: 72 enslaved people and the handful of white overseers and their families, standing in loose rows while Hale read from his Bible about thieves and consequences. Thomas stood beneath the branch with a noose around his neck, balanced on a wagon that would be pulled away on Hale's signal. His eyes found Micah's in the crowd. No plea in them, just acknowledgement. Hale gave the signal. The wagon moved. Thomas dropped. But Jonathan Hale believed in teaching lessons, not simply ending lives. He had calculated the rope length to produce strangulation rather than a broken neck. Thomas hung there, kicking, for 4 minutes before he went still. Micah counted every second. Hannah stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm so tightly her nails broke skin. They cut Thomas down at 4:18 in the afternoon. Hale announced that the body would hang overnight as a continued reminder. Micah and 2 other men were ordered to rig it back up and to ensure the branch remained sound for future use. That night, while positioning his brother's corpse for display, Micah noticed something. The rope had frayed slightly where it passed over the branch. The wood itself showed stress marks at the point of greatest load. Small details. But Micah Freeman had spent 20 years learning to read what materials said about the forces acting on them. Physics doesn't care about skin color. April brought relentless rain to the Midlands of South Carolina. The cotton fields turned to red mud. Planting was delayed. Jonathan Hale grew irritable, which meant the plantation grew dangerous. 3 people were whipped that month for minor infractions. 1 woman was sold away from her children for the crime of singing while working. And on April 27th, Hannah Freeman made the mistake of spilling tea on Catherine Hale's dress. It was an accident. The ceramic pot was poorly balanced on the serving tray. Catherine had shifted suddenly in her chair. The brown liquid spread across expensive white cotton, but accidents didn't matter at Hale Grove. Only consequences did. Jonathan Hale ordered Hannah to the tree. The rope went around her neck at 2:30 in the afternoon. The entire household staff was assembled. Micah stood in the 3rd row, his face as blank as he could make it, his mind racing through calculations he didn't yet know how to use. But this time, something failed. The branch groaned under Hannah's weight. The rope stretched, and 30 seconds into the hanging, the rope snapped. Hannah fell 6 feet and landed hard, gasping and retching. The crowd stood frozen. Jonathan Hale stared at the frayed rope end swinging above his wife's ruined dress pattern in the red mud. "Defective equipment," Hale announced finally. "Micah, you will inspect and repair the apparatus. Ensure it functions properly." Micah stepped forward. "Yes, master." Hannah was dragged back to the quarters, bruised but breathing. The sentence would be carried out again once the equipment was sound. Hale gave Micah 3 days. Those 3 days changed everything. Micah approached the problem like any carpentry project. He measured the branch thickness, tested its flexibility, examined the rope's construction. He climbed the tree a dozen times, studying angles and weights and load distribution. He had access to all of it now. Hale had given him permission to touch the machinery of death, to understand its workings. The rope that had broken was 2 years old, weakened by sun and rain and repeated use. Micah examined the fracture point and saw how the fibers had separated under sudden stress. He replaced it with new hemp, 1 inch thick, properly oiled. He tested knots. He learned that a running noose tightened differently than a fixed loop. He discovered that rope grain mattered, that twist direction affected friction. He also learned the branch. The live oak was strong, but it was living wood. It flexed. The point where the rope bore down had developed a slight depression over 2 years of hangings. Water collected there when it rained, softening the surface. Micah carved that section smooth and wrapped it with leather to protect the rope. He was being helpful. He was ensuring the equipment functioned as intended. But he was also learning. On the morning of April 30th, Hannah Freeman was brought to the tree again. Fresh rope, tested branch, proper knot, the noose went around her neck. Jonathan Hale read from Scripture. The signal was given. The wagon moved. Hannah dropped, and Micah watched with the knowledge of exactly how much force was being applied, at what angle, producing what outcome. She hung for 45 seconds. Then the branch cracked. Not broke, just cracked. A sound like a gunshot. The branch dipped 6 inches. The rope went slack. Hannah dropped to her knees, coughing and alive. Jonathan Hale stared at the tree in disbelief. Impossible. The wood was sound. Might be rot inside, master, Micah offered quietly. Oak can look solid but be weak at the core. I can inspect it properly, cut away the damaged section. 2 days later, Micah was back in the tree with a saw. He removed 3 feet of the hanging branch and reinforced the remaining section with iron brackets. He worked slowly, testing everything. And while he worked, he thought about leverage and weight distribution and the precise angle at which green wood will crack before it breaks. Hannah survived. Hale decided her punishment had been sufficient given the equipment failures. She went back to the main house, moving carefully, speaking to no one. That night in their cabin, she lay beside Micah in the darkness. "What did you do?" she whispered. "Fixed the tree." "Micah." He was quiet for a long time. "Finally, I learned some things. Things that make branches crack. Things that might, if circumstances aligned properly. If someone understood how forces distribute through living wood under specific load conditions." Hannah's hand found his in the dark. "They'll kill you if they know. They'll kill us anyway. Eventually, one way or another." She said nothing, but her grip tightened. The tree was teaching back. Between May and December of 1863, Jonathan Hale used the hanging tree 11 more times. Not all ended in death. Some were brief demonstrations meant to terrify rather than execute. A man named Joshua hung for 30 seconds for talking back. A woman named Patience hung for 2 minutes for working too slowly. A boy of 14 named Samuel hung until he lost consciousness, then was cut down and revived and sent back to the fields. Each time, Micah Freeman was responsible for preparing the equipment. He tested the rope. He inspected the branch. He tied the knots. And each time he learned something new. He learned that rope stretches. Not much, perhaps 2% of its length under the weight of a human body, but enough to matter if you're calculating drop distance. He learned that knot placement affects noose tightening speed. A knot positioned behind the left ear produces faster unconsciousness than one behind the right. He learned that humidity weakens hemp by 4%, that a man weighing 160 pounds exerts approximately 3,200 pounds of force on a rope if dropped from 8 feet with 0 slack. He learned these things because Jonathan Hale wanted the tree to function perfectly. Because a plantation owner who used hanging as theater needed his stage machinery reliable. Because Micah was allowed, even expected, to understand the physics of execution. The plantation records from Hale Grove, preserved in the South Carolina archives, show 13 disciplinary actions via suspension between March 1863 and February 1864. 9 people survived. 4 did not. Their names were Thomas Freeman, age 24, Abraham Mitchell, age 38, Sarah Kimball, age 19, and Daniel Cross, age 41. Micah knew all of them. Thomas was his brother. Abraham had taught him how to sharpen a chisel properly. Sarah had been Hannah's closest friend. Daniel had worked beside him on the construction of the new tobacco barn 2 years earlier. Each death was documented. Each was ruled justified under South Carolina law. Each added to the weight Micah carried every time he climbed that tree. But he also noticed patterns in the survivors. The rope snapped during Abraham Mitchell's hanging. The branch cracked during Sarah Kimball's. Daniel Cross's noose came untied at the critical moment. Small failures, equipment malfunctions, accidents that happen just frequently enough to seem plausible but just rarely enough not to appear suspicious. By December, Micah had mastered the mathematics of salvation. He knew how to weaken a rope section without making it obvious. He knew where to cut a branch so it would crack under a specific weight. He knew how to tie a slip knot that looked like a noose, but would loosen under the right kind of struggle. He couldn't save everyone. The choices were impossible. If he saved too many, someone would notice the pattern. If he saved the wrong person, Hale might investigate the equipment more thoroughly. So Micah made decisions that haunted him. He let some people die so he could save others later. He chose based on who had young children, who had skills the community needed, who Hale was most likely to hang again if they survived. It was a mathematics no human being should have to perform. But Micah Freeman performed it anyway, night after night, working through the calculations while Hannah lay beside him and the wind moved through the gaps in their cabin walls. The war news that filtered into Hale Grove that winter was contradictory. Confederate victories in Virginia, Union control of the Mississippi, something about an Emancipation Proclamation that supposedly freed enslaved people in rebel territory, though no one at Hale Grove saw any evidence of freedom arriving. Some of the younger men whispered about running, about trying to reach Union lines. But Union lines were somewhere in Tennessee or Virginia, 300 miles, away through Confederate territory, with patrols and dogs and white civilians who would report any black person traveling without papers. On December 18th, a field hand named Marcus tried anyway. He made it 9 miles before the dogs tracked him to a creek bed. They brought him back, tied to a horse. Jonathan Hale ordered him to the tree. This time, Micah made no mistakes. The rope was sound. The branch was solid. The knot was perfect. Marcus hung until he was dead, and his body stayed there for 3 days as a warning to anyone else considering flight. Micah watched from the quarters and understood something that made his hands shake. He could have saved Marcus, could have prepared the equipment to fail. But he chose not to, because Marcus's escape attempt had put everyone else at risk. Hale was watching more closely now. Any suspicious failures would trigger investigations, so Micah let Marcus die to maintain the illusion that the equipment simply failed sometimes, randomly, unpredictably. That night, Hannah found Micah sitting outside their cabin in the cold, staring at nothing. "I'm becoming what they are," he said quietly, "making choices about who lives and dies. No, her hand on his shoulder. They make choices because they can. You make choices because you have to. That's different. Is it? She had no answer for that. 13 weights, 13 lessons. One question with no good answer. The war reached Colombia in January 1864. Not the fighting itself, but its aftermath. Wounded Confederate soldiers filled the hospitals. Refugees from coastal areas arrived with stories about Union ships and burned plantations. Food grew scarce. The Confederate dollar bought less each month. Jonathan Hale's mood darkened with the economy. The county's white population responded to the mounting pressure by tightening control. New patrols were organized. A curfew was established for all enslaved people. The penalty for being found off your plantation without a pass was 50 lashes for the first offense, hanging for the second. The white community was terrified that news of Lincoln's proclamation would spark an uprising. What they didn't understand, what they chose not to understand, was that enslaved people had always known how to pass information. There was a network older than memory, carried in songs and stories and the particular way a person might mention where they'd seen dogs patrolling or which roads were being watched. The network didn't organize rebellion. It simply shared information that helped people survive. Micah learned through this network that similar hangings were happening on other plantations. A place called Millwood had a whipping post used so frequently, the ground around it was stained dark. A plantation near Winsboro had a work detail specifically for grave digging. The system wasn't unique to Hale Grove. It was everywhere, and it was being documented nowhere. The South Carolina Legal Code in 1864 permitted plantation owners to administer reasonable correction to their enslaved workers. The definition of reasonable was left to the owner's discretion. County courts kept records of enslaved people sold, purchased, or inherited, but not of those punished or killed. In the eyes of the law, what happened to an enslaved person on their owner's property was a private matter, like deciding which crops to plant or which lumber to sell. This legal erasure meant that Jonathan Hale faced no oversight. No inspector came to Hale Grove to verify treatment. No prosecutor questioned his methods. The hanging tree existed in a space outside official scrutiny, visible to everyone but recorded by no one, except Micah. He kept his own accounts. Not on paper, that would be suicide, but in the careful architecture of memory. He remembered names and dates. He remembered which white overseers watched the hangings with satisfaction and which looked away. He remembered that Reverend Thomas Whitmore came to Hale Grove twice monthly to provide religious instruction to the enslaved population, and never once mentioned the tree that stood visible from the chapel area. He remembered that Dr. Samuel Bradford treated Catherine Hale's headaches and Jonathan Hale's gout, and rode past the quarters without stopping to tend to people whose injuries came from the very man paying his bills. The complicity was structural. It wasn't that these men actively participated in the hangings. It was that their participation wasn't required. They simply had to continue their normal routines while knowing what happened 50 yards away. They had to schedule their visits for days when the tree wasn't being used, or arrive late enough that the crowds had dispersed. In March, a new overseer arrived. His name was William Ketchum, and he came from a plantation in Georgia with a reputation for efficiency. He was perhaps 40 years old, thin and weathered, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen most of what the world offered and wasn't impressed by any of it. Ketchum spent his first week observing operations. He watched the field work. He examined the equipment. And on his 8th day, he approached Micah while Micah was repairing a plow blade. "You maintain the hanging apparatus," Ketchum said. Not a question, Yes, sir. How often does it fail? Micah kept his eyes on the plow blade, his voice level. Can't say exactly, sir. Equipment's only as good as the materials. Rope wears out, wood cracks. Acts of God, I suppose. Acts of God. Ketchum studied him. The tree seems to fail more often than one might expect from divine intervention. Micah's pulse hammered, but he kept his hands steady on the whetstone. I do my best to maintain it properly, sir, but I work with what I'm given. A long silence. Then, see that you continue doing your best. Ketchum walked away. Micah exhaled slowly. The overseer suspected something. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to watch more, carefully. That meant Micah's margin for error had just disappeared. That night, he told Hannah they needed to stop. No more sabotaged equipment. No more calculated failures. The risk was too high. She listened, then said, Rachel's husband is being brought to the tree tomorrow. He talked about the war where Hale could hear him. I can't save everyone. I know. If I try and Ketchum notices, I know Micah. She didn't ask him to save anyone. She simply told him the situation and let him carry the weight of choice. What would you do, knowing that action might save one person, but expose dozens to worse consequences? Knowing that inaction makes you complicit in a death you might have prevented? The mathematics of impossible choices doesn't offer solutions. It only offers different kinds of guilt. Micah Freeman lay awake that night calculating drop distances and rope strengths and the specific angle required to make an iron bracket fail under load. Then he calculated what would happen to Hannah if he was caught. What would happen to the other people who depended on his repairs? What would happen if the one tool they had, the invisible, unprovable possibility that the equipment might save them, was discovered and destroyed? By dawn, he had made his decision. Rachel's husband would hang on sound equipment. Micah would not risk the network for one life. He watched the hanging from the third row, watched the man drop, watched him strangle, watched Rachel collapse, and understood that he had joined the machinery. Not as operator, but as collaborator. Someone who made calculations and lived with them. Sometimes survival means becoming what you hate in smaller measure. April 1864 brought unusual traffic through Hale Grove. Confederate recruiters came looking for volunteers to work on fortifications near Charleston. A tax assessor arrived to inventory property, including enslaved people for Confederate revenue purposes. A colonel from the 6th South Carolina Cavalry stopped overnight while his unit rested en route to Virginia. Each visitor saw the hanging tree. None mentioned it in their reports. The tax assessor, a man named Harrison Pettigrew, spent 3 days at Hale Grove conducting his inventory. He walked through the quarters with a notebook, recording names and estimated values. Micah watched him pause beneath the tree, look up at the branch, then continue walking without writing anything down. That night, Pettigrew dined with the Hales in the main house. The conversation, overheard by Hannah as she served, touched on many subjects: the war's progress, Richmond politics, cotton prices, the reliability of enslaved labor during uncertain times. Do you have trouble with insubordination? Pettigrew asked at one point. Nothing we can't handle, Jonathan Hale replied. I believe in clear consequences for misbehavior. Keeps everyone focused. Of course. Firm but fair management. Essential in times like these. Sakchuma tree was never mentioned directly, but its presence informed the conversation like a silent participant. Everyone knew what clear consequences meant. Everyone understood that Hale Grove's relative stability, no recorded escape attempts since Marcus, no work stoppages, no serious injuries to white overseers, came from a specific form of terror. And everyone, including the tax assessor representing the Confederate government, chose to let that terror continue unmolested because it served their interests. The ledger Pettigrew filed in Columbia listed 71 enslaved people at Hale Grove, valued at a total of 48,000 Confederate dollars. One person had died since the previous assessment, listed simply as field hand, male, natural causes. No mention of Thomas Freeman, no mention of how he'd actually died. The bureaucratic machinery recorded economic loss without recording human death. Micah learned about the ledger from a woman named Mattie who worked in the main house and could read well enough to sound out official documents left on desks. She told him what she'd seen, and Micah understood that there would be no official record of anything happening at Hale Grove. If liberation came, if the war somehow ended slavery, there would be no archive proving what Jonathan Hale had done. Just property records and tax assessments and bills of sale, unless someone kept their own accounts. So Micah began doing something dangerous. He started marking wood. Nothing obvious, just small notations carved into boards and beams in places no one would examine closely. A date scratched into the underside of a workbench, initials hidden in the joinery of a barn door, a tally mark on the back of a tool handle. Each mark represented a person. Each date recorded a hanging. He carved Thomas's initials into the doorframe of their shared cabin. He marked Abraham Mitchell's death date on a fence post. He cut Sarah Kimball's initials into the branch of the hanging tree itself, small enough to be invisible unless you knew to look. It was a futile gesture in many ways. Who would ever see these marks? Who would know how to read them? But Micah needed to believe that someone, someday, might find these tiny rebellions and understand that people here had names and lives and deaths that mattered. Hannah discovered what he was doing in May when she found him carving Daniel Cross's initials into a roof beam during a repair. "That's dangerous," she said quietly. "Everything is dangerous. They'll think you're marking targets, planning something." "Maybe I am." She looked at him carefully. "Planning what?" Micah finished the carving, DC 1863, and ran his thumb over the letters. Witness, just witness. Someone has to remember this happened. The Confederate colonel who stayed at Hale Grove was named Marcus Sullivan. He was a thin man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone born to authority. He brought 30 soldiers with him, men who set up camp in the field beyond the cotton rows and spent 2 days resting their horses and themselves. Colonel Sullivan dined with the Hales both nights. On the second evening, with wine flowing freely, the conversation turned to the future of the Confederacy. "We'll prevail," Sullivan said. "We have to. The alternative is unthinkable." "And if we don't?" Catherine Hale asked. Sullivan's face darkened. "Then we'll face a world where the natural order is inverted, where those who should serve become uppity, where discipline collapses." He gestured vaguely toward the quarters. "I'd sooner burn it all than see that happen." Jonathan Hale raised his glass. "Agreed. If the Confederacy falls, I'll free no one. I'll see them in the ground first." The men drank to that sentiment. In the kitchen, Hannah heard every word. She repeated them to Micah that night, and he filed them away in the growing architecture of evidence he was building in memory and wood. They were saying it openly now. The desperation made them honest. Reverend Thomas Whitmore arrived at Hale Grove on the first and third Sunday of each month to provide religious instruction. He was a man of approximately 50 years, educated at a seminary in Charleston, and he genuinely believed he was doing God's work, by teaching enslaved people about obedience, patience, and the rewards awaiting them in heaven. His sermons followed predictable themes: the importance of submission to earthly authority, the virtue of accepting one's lot without complaint, the example of biblical servants who remained faithful despite hardship. He never preached about Moses leading people from bondage. He never mentioned the prophets who spoke against injustice. Reverend Whitmore held his services in a cleared area near the quarters, under the same oak trees that provided shade to the cabins. The hanging tree stood 60 feet away, clearly visible. Sometimes the rope was still in place from recent use. Sometimes a body had been cut down only hours before the Reverend's arrival. He never acknowledged it. Not once in the 2 years Micah had been attending services. The tree existed in a space the Reverend's theology couldn't accommodate, so he simply behaved as though it wasn't there. On June 5, 1864, Reverend Whitmore arrived for his usual service. 2 days earlier, a woman named Esther had been hanged for the crime of attempting to hide her 10-year-old son when Hale wanted him sent to work in the fields. Micah had prepared the equipment. The rope had been sound. Esther had died. Her body had been cut down only that morning. The ground beneath the tree still showed where she'd hung. Reverend Whitmore conducted his service as though nothing had happened. He read from Ephesians, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling." He spoke about the importance of faithful service. He led them in a hymn about heavenly rewards. 70 people stood or sat in that clearing, and everyone could see the hanging tree. Everyone knew what had happened to Esther, and the Reverend spoke about obedience without once mentioning the machinery of death that enforced it. After the service, as people dispersed, Micah found himself walking near Whitmore as the Reverend prepared to leave. "Reverend," Micah said carefully, "might I ask a question about Scripture?" Whitmore turned, smiling. "Of course, my son. In the Bible, when Moses led people from Egypt, was that against God's will? Were those people wrong to want freedom?" The smile froze. Whitmore's eyes grew hard. That was different. Those were God's chosen people in a specific covenant situation. The circumstances have no bearing on present social arrangements ordained by divine providence. So God wanted them free but wants us enslaved? Micah, isn't it? The carpenter? Yes, sir. Be careful, son. Questions like that suggest a dangerous pride, a refusal to accept the wisdom of those better educated in Scripture. He paused. Let the threat hang. Master Hale speaks highly of your work. I'd hate to see you lose his favor through theological impertinence. The message was clear. Questioning the religious justification for slavery was itself grounds for punishment. The Reverend would report such questions to Hale. Micah lowered his eyes. I meant no disrespect, Reverend. Just trying to understand God's ways. Then understand this. Obedience is its own virtue. Trust that God has placed each of us in our proper station. Whitmore patted Micah's shoulder in a gesture meant to be fatherly, but felt like threat. Be faithful, Micah. That's all the theology you need. The Reverend rode away. Micah watched him go, understanding something that made his jaw ache from clenching. The tree wasn't an aberration in Whitmore's theology. It was a confirmation, a tool that God, in his divine wisdom, had provided to masters to keep servants in their place. The Reverend didn't look away from the hanging tree because he didn't see it. He looked away because he saw it perfectly well and approved. That evening, Micah told Hannah about the exchange. He's not going to help, she said. Simple statement of fact. No one is. Then we only have ourselves. Micah had been thinking the same thing. The white community, from overseers to tax assessors to men of God, formed an interlocking system of complicity. Each person played their role. Each one enabled the others. Waiting for any of them to intervene was like waiting for the hanging tree to uproot itself and walk away. But the war news continued filtering through the network. Union armies advancing, Confederate forces struggling. Something called the Wilderness Campaign that sounded disastrous. Port cities falling, supply lines collapsing. And with each Confederate setback, Jonathan Hale's mood grew darker. He increased patrols around the plantation. He shortened rations. He began conducting surprise searches of the quarters, looking for weapons or contraband. He sensed that his world was fracturing, and he responded by tightening his grip until his knuckles showed white. On June 23rd, he called a mandatory assembly. All 71 enslaved people, plus the white overseers, gathered in the clearing near the quarters. Hale stood on a raised platform, the same one used for auctions when he occasionally sold someone. "I've been hearing rumors," Hale announced. "Foolish talk about federal armies and emancipation. Let me make something perfectly clear. This plantation will never free its labor force. Not through Lincoln's illegal proclamations. Not through Confederate defeat. Not through any means whatsoever." He gestured to the hanging tree. "That tree has stood for nearly 80 years. It will stand 80 more if necessary. I will see every single person here in the ground before I see them walk away as free men and women. Am I understood?" Silence. 71 people staring at the ground, understanding that the threat wasn't idle. Hale meant it literally. If freedom came, he would kill them rather than let them have it. "Now get back to work." The crowd dispersed. Micah walked back to the quarters with his mind racing. Hale had just announced his intention to commit mass murder rather than comply with emancipation. And he had done so in front of witnesses who could do nothing with that knowledge, who had no authority to report it, who existed in a legal space where their testimony about their own planned murder would be considered worthless. That night, Micah climbed the hanging tree. He ostensibly was inspecting the rope. Ketchum had asked him to verify its condition. But really, Micah was thinking about the scaffold, about the platform Hale had stood on, about mechanisms and weight distribution and the mathematics of simultaneous failure. An idea was forming, terrible, necessary, utterly clear. If the tree couldn't be uprooted, maybe it could be taught a final lesson. The scaffold had been built 3 years earlier for a sale that never materialized. It stood 8 feet tall, constructed from heart pine joists and planks. Steps led up to a platform roughly 10 feet square. Jonathan Hale used it for announcements, for auctions, for any occasion where he wanted to literally look down on his assembled labor force. In July 1864, Hale ordered Micah to expand it. He wanted a larger platform that could accommodate multiple people during the mass hanging he was increasingly convinced would become necessary. He wanted the steps reinforced. He wanted iron rings installed for securing ropes. "Make it permanent," Hale instructed. "Strong enough to last." Micah sketched designs. He showed them to Hale for approval, and he began building something that looked like a scaffold but contained hidden mathematics. The key insight had come to Micah during his months of studying the hanging tree. Weight and support were related in ways most people didn't think about. A platform held up by 4 posts will fail if any one post suddenly loses integrity. A trapdoor secured by a single bolt can be disguised to look like it's secured by 4. What Micah designed was a scaffold with a fundamental flaw built into its architecture. The platform would be stable under normal use. It could hold 20 people standing. But if a specific combination of conditions occurred, if weight was placed in exactly the right spot while someone pulled a specific concealed rope, the entire thing would collapse. He worked on it for 3 weeks. He cut mortises and tenons. He joined posts to beams. He installed the iron rings Hale wanted, positioning them precisely. And he embedded into the structure a series of failures waiting to happen. One post was cut 3 inches shorter than the others. Not enough to notice visually, but enough that it bore slightly less load than its companions. The platform decking looked uniform, but 2 boards were cut from green wood that would shrink as it dried, creating gaps. The iron rings were attached to the platform surface rather than to the underlying joists, so they would pull free under sufficient lateral stress. Most importantly, Micah installed what appeared to be a standard trapdoor mechanism in the platform center, a rectangular section that could drop open, allowing for classic scaffold hangings. The door was secured by 4 metal pins, 1 at each corner, but 3 of those pins were dummies. They looked functional, but bore no load. All the actual support came from a single pin concealed beneath a decorative iron plate. And that pin was connected to a rope that ran down through the hollow post, through a channel Micah had carved in the scaffold's internal structure, and emerged behind the steps where it was tied off to what looked like a structural support. Pull that rope, and the trapdoor would open regardless of what pins appeared to be securing it. Micah showed the completed scaffold to Hale in early August. The platform stood solid. The steps were firm. The iron rings gleamed. Hale climbed to the top, walked around, tested the trapdoor mechanism. Everything functioned perfectly. Excellent work, Micah. This will serve well when the time comes. Yes, Master. What Hale didn't know, what he couldn't know without disassembling the entire structure, was that the scaffold was a trap waiting to be sprung. That every piece Micah had so carefully constructed contained dual purpose. That the carpenter he trusted to build his machinery of death had built instead a machine that could reverse that death onto its designer. But Micah still had a problem. The rope that controlled the trapdoor was accessible, but pulling it would be obvious. Anyone could do it, but they'd be seen. And even if the trapdoor opened under Hale, even if he fell through, the rope around any enslaved person's neck would still tighten. The machinery would still kill its intended victim. Unless that rope wasn't connected to anything. So Micah began the most dangerous phase of his plan. He started maintaining 2 ropes. The visible one that ran from the iron ring through a pulley block to the noose. That one was what everyone saw, what was tested, what appeared functional. But Micah also installed a second concealed rope that ran through the hollow post, completely separate from the system actually connected to the noose. When someone was brought to the scaffold for hanging, Micah would tie the noose to the concealed rope rather than the visible one. It would look identical. The victim would stand with the noose around their neck. But when the trapdoor opened, the visible rope would pull tight while the concealed rope, the one actually connected to the noose, would remain slack. The person would fall, but only as far as the platform height, maybe 8 feet. Not pleasant, but survivable. Meanwhile, the visible rope system would behave exactly as expected, creating the appearance of a proper hanging. It was elaborate. It required everything to happen in sequence, and it required that no one examine the scaffold too closely. Micah tested the concealed rope system at night, in darkness, pulling the release while standing on the platform and feeling how the structure responded. The trapdoor dropped smoothly. The visible rope jerked as designed. But the concealed rope he'd threaded through the post remained unchanged. In theory, it would work. In theory, he could make it look like Jonathan Hale was demonstrating his new hanging platform, could make the trapdoor open beneath the master instead of the victim, could create a scenario where an enslaved person fell to safety while their owner fell to his death. But theory was different from execution. Micah would have one chance. If he failed, if any element malfunctioned, if anyone noticed the switched ropes or the hidden release mechanism, then he would be the next person hanging from the tree, and likely everyone who'd ever helped him. Hannah. The people in the quarters who'd kept silent about suspicious equipment failures. He lay awake night after night, running through the sequence, calculating, doubting, wondering if he was capable of what he was planning. Because this wasn't defending himself. This wasn't even preventing a death. This was premeditated execution of a white man by an enslaved person. If discovered, it would be the worst crime imaginable in South Carolina law. Torture before death. Probably public execution. An example that would terrify every enslaved person in the state. Hannah seemed to sense his escalating tension. In mid-August, lying beside him in the darkness, she asked the question directly. "You're planning something." "I'm always planning something." "Micah, I know you. You're planning something specific." He was quiet. Then, "If I tell you, you become part of it. If they catch me, they'll question you." "They'll question me anyway," he told her. "Everything. The scaffold, design, the hidden ropes, the way it could be triggered." His plan to wait for Hale's promised mass hanging and to instead turn the machinery against its maker. Hannah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Finally, "You know he'll keep his promise. He'll kill everyone here rather than see us free." "I know." "And you think you can stop him?" "I think I can remove him. Whether that stops anything or just makes it worse, I don't know." "How many people will die if you don't try?" 71. However many survive until the Yankees arrive. "And if you do try and it fails?" "Probably the same number, plus me, plus anyone he decides was involved." Hannah's hand found his. "That's not the real question." "What is? Can you live with trying and failing, or not trying at all?" Micah had no answer, but he knew which haunted him more in the dark. The architecture was ready. Now came the question of will. September brought news that couldn't be contained. Atlanta had fallen. Sherman's army was burning its way through Georgia. Confederate forces were collapsing faster than they could retreat. The war's outcome was no longer in question, only its timing. At Hale Grove, this news manifested as escalating paranoia. Jonathan Hale tripled patrols. He armed his overseers with rifles. He gathered the enslaved population 3 times in 1 week to deliver increasingly unhinged speeches about loyalty and consequences. "The Yankees will not arrive in time to save you," he announced on September 12th. "Even if they do, you'll be dead before they reach the gates. I've made my position clear. This plantation will have no free labor. Ever." The threat was no longer theoretical. Hale had begun making specific plans. He ordered Ketchum to inventory hemp rope. He had Micah reinforce additional branches on the hanging tree, enough to accommodate multiple bodies simultaneously. He drew up a list of names, people he considered most likely to cause trouble if freed, and shared it with his overseers. Micah's name was on that list. So was Hannah's. The Confederate Army's desperation manifested locally in the form of impressment raids. Military units would sweep through areas, seizing supplies and forcing enslaved men into labor gangs to build fortifications. A unit came through the region in mid-September, taking 23 men from surrounding plantations. Jonathan Hale bought his way out. He paid a substantial bribe to the captain leading the impressment raid, ensuring that his own workforce remained intact. He needed them for the harvest, and possibly for his darker plans. But the raid's passage meant news traveled. Men from other plantations were being worked on fortifications near Columbia. They saw federal prisoners. They heard soldiers talking about Sherman's advance. And when a few of them escaped from the work gangs and made their way home, they brought specific intelligence. A man named Abraham from the Millwood plantation arrived at Hale Grove on September 21st. He'd escaped from a work gang and was trying to reach Union lines somewhere north of Columbia. He stayed one night, sleeping in the quarters, sharing what he'd learned. They're saying Sherman's army could be here by October, maybe November. The Confederates can't stop them. Abraham spoke quietly, surrounded by people desperate for confirmation. I saw how scared the officers were. They know it's over. What happens when the Yankees arrive? Someone asked. Freedom, real freedom. Lincoln's proclamation becomes enforceable. And what about masters who won't comply? Abraham's face darkened. That's why I'm running now. Because I heard officers talking about what some owners are planning. How they'd rather burn everything than see their property walk away free. Micah listened from the back of the crowd. After the gathering dispersed, he found Abraham alone. You've seen other plantations, other preparations. Abraham nodded. 3 places I worked on the fortifications. Owners came to inspect us, all of them saying the same thing, that they'd free no one, that the choice was between keeping their labor force or eliminating them. How many owners are planning this? Enough. More than you'd think. It's organized. They meet, they talk, they make plans together. Abraham studied Micah. You're the carpenter, the one who maintains the hanging tree. That's me. Then you know what's coming. I know what's planned. Abraham was quiet then. I'm leaving tonight, heading north. If you have any sense, you'll do the same. Can't. Too many people here depend on what I can do. What can you do against an armed white man who's decided you're dying? Micah didn't answer. Abraham left that night. Micah never learned if he made it to freedom or was caught and killed trying. But Abraham's information confirmed what Micah had suspected. Hale wasn't unique. He was part of a network. Plantation owners across the region were making the same decision. Better dead labor than free labor. The mathematics of hatred required eliminating everyone who might testify about what had happened. Better to burn the witnesses along with the evidence. In early October, Jonathan Hale held a meeting at his plantation. 5 other owners arrived, men from surrounding properties. They gathered in Hale's study with whiskey and cigars, while Micah worked on repairing a window frame close enough to overhear. We need a coordinated response, one owner said. If the Federals arrive and find our labor forces intact, they'll enforce emancipation immediately. Agreed, Hale replied. But if there's no one left to emancipate? Exactly. The question is timing. We can't act too early. We need the cotton brought in, but we can't wait until federal troops are visible. Another voice. I propose we set a date, mid-November. If Sherman's army hasn't arrived by then, we assume they will soon. Better to act on our own schedule than be forced to react. And the method? Individually, as suits each property. But the important thing is simultaneity. If we all act together, there's no one left to report inconsistencies. They talked for another hour, refining the plan. Micah heard enough to understand that at least 6 plantations were planning mass killings. Probably more. Hundreds of people marked for death because their owners preferred genocide to granting freedom. When the meeting ended and the visitors departed, Micah found Ketchum near the stables. "Need to ask a question, sir." Ketchum turned. "What is it?" "The new scaffold. Master Hale mentioned he might want a demonstration soon. Should I prepare for that?" Ketchum's eyes narrowed. "A demonstration of what?" "How the equipment functions, how it can accommodate multiple uses. I'll let you know. But yes, be ready. Master Hale wants to ensure everything operates smoothly when the time comes." Micah returned to the quarters. The network was already spreading word about what the white owners were planning. Fear had moved beyond anxiety into something colder. Recognition. The people at Hale Grove understood they were being measured for death, and there was no legal recourse, no authority to appeal to, no protection available. On October 8th, Hale announced his demonstration would occur on October 28th. He wanted to test the new scaffold's full capabilities. He wanted to show his overseers and neighboring plantation owners how efficiently the equipment could function. And he wanted the entire enslaved population of Hale Grove to watch. 20 days to prepare. 20 days until everything changed. 3 weeks before the scheduled demonstration, Jonathan Hale selected his subjects. 2 men. Joshua, age 42, a field hand who'd complained about reduced rations, and Daniel, age 35, who'd been caught possessing a newspaper someone had thrown away near the road. Their crimes were trivial. Their sentences were death. Hale wanted them as examples. More importantly, he wanted to test Micah's scaffold under working conditions before whatever larger event he was planning. Make sure the mechanisms functioned. Verify that the trapdoor opened reliably. Confirm that the iron rings held multiple ropes. "I want you to prepare everything," Hale told Micah on October 7th. "Fresh rope. Test every connection. This needs to be perfect." "Yes, Master." "And Micah? No equipment failures this time. If anything goes wrong, you'll be joining them." Micah understood. Hale had finally connected the pattern of suspicious malfunctions to the one person who maintained the equipment. He had no proof, but he had enough suspicion to make threats. This demonstration would be Micah's test as much as the scaffold's. For a week, Micah prepared. He worked in plain view, letting everyone see him testing the trapdoor mechanism, checking the rope quality, reinforcing the platform. He made everything look absolutely standard. But, at night, he worked on the concealed systems. The hidden rope threaded through the hollow post. The release mechanism disguised as a structural support. The carefully calibrated weights that would make everything function, or fail, exactly as designed. Hannah watched him work, saying nothing. She understood what was coming. They both did. Either the scaffold would work as Micah intended, or they would both die on it. On October 14th, Micah completed the preparations. That evening, he climbed onto the scaffold's platform and stood where Hale would stand during the demonstration. He looked out over the empty space where 71 people would be forced to watch. He imagined the sequence of events about to unfold. Then he climbed down and did something he'd been avoiding. He visited the 2 men scheduled to die. Joshua and Daniel were being held in the equipment shed, chained to iron rings bolted into the floor. Micah entered with permission. He was ostensibly checking that the shed's door latch was secure. "Brother Micah," Joshua said quietly. Micah knelt between them. "I need to ask you both something." "Ask." "If I told you that you might survive the hanging, but that it would require things looking very wrong for a few minutes, and that you'd need to trust me completely without knowing the plan. Would you?" The two men looked at each other. Daniel spoke first. "You saying you can save us?" "I'm saying I might be able to change how this ends, but I can't explain how, and I can't promise it works. I need you to trust me and stay calm no matter what happens." "What do we need to do?" "When you drop through the trapdoor, don't fight. Go limp immediately. Even if it feels like you're falling free, don't struggle. The less you move, the better it works." Joshua studied Micah's face. "You've been saving people all along. The equipment failures." "Sometimes." "Why?" "Because someone had to." "And now?" "Now I'm trying something bigger, but it might fail. If it does..." "We were dead anyway," Daniel interrupted. "At least this way we might see tomorrow." Micah gripped their shoulders briefly, then left. 2 days later, additional news arrived that changed everything. A rider came through the area on October 16th, spreading information. Sherman's army had left Atlanta. They were marching southeast, cutting a swath of destruction 60 miles wide. They were burning plantations, freeing enslaved people, destroying Confederate infrastructure, and they were headed toward South Carolina. The timeline had accelerated. Federal troops might arrive in weeks rather than months. That meant the plantation owners' coordinated plan would have to happen sooner. That meant Hale's demonstration on October 28th might be the last opportunity to change anything. Jonathan Hale called an emergency meeting of the same group that had gathered earlier. They met on October 18th. Micah wasn't close enough to overhear this time, but the participants, faces as they left, told him everything. The decision had been made. The mass killings would happen soon. That night, Micah gathered a small group in the quarters. 10 people he trusted absolutely. He told them what he'd learned, what was being planned, and what he intended to try. "I can't save everyone if Hale decides to kill us all at once," Micah said. "But I can remove him. If he's gone, maybe his wife will change the plan. Maybe the other owners will hesitate. Maybe it buys time for the Yankees to arrive." "And if it doesn't work?" someone asked. "Then we're no worse off than we are now." A woman named Sarah spoke up. "What do you need from us?" "Witnesses. When it happens, I need everyone watching carefully. Multiple people who can testify that whatever occurs was an accident, that the master was demonstrating equipment and something failed. The more people who tell the same story, the harder it is to prove anything else." They agreed. The network spread the word. When the demonstration happened, 71 people would be watching, and they would all remember it the same way. The days compressed. Micah refined his mechanisms. He tested the concealed rope one final time. He verified that the trapdoor release functioned smoothly, and he made one last addition to the scaffold's architecture. He carved 4 names into the underside of the platform, where no one would see them unless they looked from directly below. Thomas Freeman, Abraham Mitchell, Sarah Kimball, Daniel Cross. The dead whose presence would witness what came next. October 27th arrived. Tomorrow was the demonstration. Micah barely slept. He ran through the sequence endlessly. Hale would want to show the visiting owners how the scaffold functioned. He would climb to the platform. He would position himself over the trap door. And at that exact moment, Micah would need to be in position to pull the concealed release. If Hale stood in the wrong place, it wouldn't work. If someone was watching Micah too closely, he couldn't make the pull. If anyone examined the scaffold at the wrong moment and noticed the hidden rope system, everything would collapse. But if it worked, if everything aligned, Then tomorrow Jonathan Hale would drop through his own trap door, hang from his own rope, and die by the machinery he'd created. One chance, one sequence, one pull of a rope. October 28th, 1864. Dawn came with unseasonable cold, the air sharp enough to sting lungs. Micah woke before first light and walked to the scaffold. He tested the platform one final time, verified that the concealed rope moved freely, checked that the trapdoor mechanism was properly reset. Everything functioned perfectly, which meant everything could fail perfectly. Breakfast was distributed at 6. Work assignments were given at 7. But everyone knew that by 9 o'clock, regular work would stop for the demonstration. Jonathan Hale wanted maximum attendance. He wanted every enslaved person at Hale Grove to watch what happened to Joshua and Daniel. He wanted the lesson burned into memory. At 8:30, visiting plantation owners began arriving. Micah recognized 3 of them from the earlier meeting, men who'd been coordinating the mass killing plan. They gathered near the scaffold, discussing technical details like this was an agricultural exhibition. Joshua and Daniel were brought out at 8:45. They were bound hand and foot, walking slowly. Micah caught Joshua's eye briefly. The man's face showed fear, but also something else. Trust. He was betting his life on Micah's plan working. The enslaved population of Hale Grove assembled in rows facing the scaffold. 71 people standing in the October morning, watching and waiting. Micah positioned himself near the scaffold's base, close to the rear support post, where the concealed release rope was tied off. At 9 o'clock exactly, Jonathan Hale climbed the scaffold steps. He wore his finest clothes, black coat, white shirt, polished boots. This was theater for him, demonstration of power and control. Ketchum and another overseer brought Joshua and Daniel up to the platform. 2 nooses were prepared. Micah had tied them the previous evening, and he'd tied them to the concealed rope system that ran through the hollow post. The visible ropes that everyone could see weren't connected to anything. They were just for show. Hale addressed the crowd. "You all know why we're here. These 2 men violated plantation discipline. But before we proceed with their punishment, I want to demonstrate the excellence of this new scaffold. You see how solidly built it is, how the mechanisms function." He walked to the center of the platform, directly over the trapdoor. Micah's pulse hammered. This was the moment. Hale was standing in exactly the right position. The visiting owners were watching the platform, not Micah. Everyone's attention was focused upward. Micah's hand found the concealed rope behind the post. One pull, that's all it would take. But his fingers froze. Because killing someone, even someone as monstrous as Jonathan Hale, wasn't a mechanical act. It required crossing a line that Micah had approached many times, but never quite crossed. It required choosing to end a human life with full knowledge and intention. It required becoming executioner. The trapdoor mechanism, Hale continued, walking toward the iron ring where the visible rope was attached, allows for clean, efficient administration of justice. Micah thought of Thomas, of Hannah, barely saved, of the list with 71 names that Hale kept in his study, of the meeting where owners discussed eliminating everyone rather than granting freedom. His fingers tightened on the rope. The strength of the construction means we can accommodate multiple subjects simultaneously, Hale said, gesturing to the second iron ring. Efficiency matters in times like these. Micah pulled. The trapdoor opened beneath Jonathan Hale's feet. He dropped through instantly, no time to react. The visible rope jerked taut as it was designed to. creating the appearance of a proper hanging. But Hale fell farther than expected because he wasn't actually connected to that rope. He fell the full 8 feet to the ground, and the concealed rope that Micah had threaded through the post caught him at the last moment. His neck broke with an audible crack. Joshua and Daniel, positioned over the same trapdoor opening, dropped as well. But they were connected to the concealed rope system, and Micah had calculated the lengths precisely. They fell 5 feet, far enough to look convincing, but not far enough to cause serious injury. Both men hit the ground beneath the platform, stunned but breathing. Chaos erupted. The visiting plantation owners rushed to the platform's edge, staring down at Hale's body swinging from the concealed rope, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Ketchum jumped down to check on him, shouted for help, tried to lift Hale's weight to create slack. But Jonathan Hale was already dead. The mechanism designed to hang enslaved people had instead hanged their master. Micah stood frozen, hands still on the release rope, watching the chaos unfold. He'd done it. He'd actually pulled the rope. The architecture had functioned exactly as designed, and now 71 witnesses had seen a white plantation owner die in what appeared to be an equipment failure during a demonstration. One of the visiting owners, a man named Pritchard, climbed onto the platform, examining the trapdoor mechanism. Micah's stomach dropped. If Pritchard investigated too closely, if he found the concealed rope system, if he traced the release mechanism back to its hiding place. But Pritchard was looking at the visible ropes, the ones everyone could see. He tested the iron rings, examined the pins securing the trapdoor corners, and he found exactly what Micah had intended him to find. A single pin that had pulled loose under load, allowing the trapdoor to open unexpectedly. The mechanism failed, Pritchard announced. The pin wasn't secured properly. Every enslaved person watching understood what they were seeing. Micah had killed Jonathan Hale, had used the master's own scaffold against him, had engineered a murder disguised so perfectly as an accident that even the investigating whites couldn't see through it. And now every single one of those witnesses had to tell the same story, had to maintain the fiction, had to protect Micah by confirming the accident narrative. In the hours that followed, as Hale's body was cut down and the scaffold was deemed too dangerous for use, as Catherine Hale collapsed in shock and doctors were summoned and officials arrived to document what happened. In all of that chaos, the enslaved population of Hale Grove said nothing. Asked what they'd seen, they described a demonstration, a trapdoor malfunction, a tragic accident. Their master had died testing equipment. The mechanism had failed at the worst possible moment. Not one person mentioned the carpenter who'd been standing near the rear post. Not one person suggested the failure had been anything but random mechanical breakdown. They protected Micah with the same unified silence that had protected all of them for decades. The difference was that now that silence was chosen, not enforced. The tree had finally taught its final lesson. The county coroner arrived at 4 that afternoon. His name was Dr. James Mercer, and he was 60 years old, skeptical by nature, and deeply uncomfortable investigating the death of a prominent plantation owner under ambiguous circumstances. He examined Hale's body in the parlor of the main house, noting the broken neck, the rope burns, the position of the corpse. He interviewed Catherine Hale, who could offer nothing useful beyond hysteria. He questioned Ketchum and the other overseers about the scaffold's construction and maintenance. And then he called for Micah. They sat in Jonathan Hale's study, the coroner behind the desk, Micah standing because enslaved men didn't sit in the presence of whites. "You built that scaffold," Mercer said. "Yes, sir." "And you maintained it?" "Yes, sir." "Tell me exactly how the trapdoor mechanism was supposed to function." Micah explained the system as he had designed it to appear. 4 pins securing the corners, a release mechanism that pulled all 4 simultaneously, metal plates distributing the load. "And what caused the failure?" "Can't say for certain, sir. Best I can figure, one of the corner pins wasn't seated properly. When the master's weight shifted, it pulled free. Once one pin goes, the others can't hold the load." "You inspected the equipment before the demonstration?" "Yes, sir. Tested the trapdoor multiple times. It worked perfectly." "But you missed that the pin was loose." Micah lowered his eyes. "Appears so, sir. I take full responsibility for the oversight." Dr. Mercer studied him. In that moment, Micah understood that the coroner suspected something. Not necessarily the full truth, but enough to know that the story didn't quite align. A competent carpenter doesn't miss a loose pin. An enslaved man who maintains execution equipment pays very close attention to detail. But Mercer also understood the political reality. Jonathan Hale was dead. The Confederate cause was collapsing. Federal troops were marching through Georgia. In a few weeks or months, the entire social order would transform. And investigating the death of a man who'd been planning mass murder of enslaved people, if that investigation led anywhere uncomfortable, would create complications no one wanted. "I'm ruling this an accidental death," Mercer said finally. "Equipment failure during demonstration. No evidence of foul play." "Yes, sir." "But Micah, if I were you, I'd be very careful going forward. Accidents have a way of following certain people." "I understand, sir." The coroner's report, filed at the Richland County Courthouse on October 30th, 1864, describes Jonathan Hale's death as misadventure resulting from mechanical failure of execution apparatus. It notes that the scaffold was examined and found to have a defective pin securing the trapdoor mechanism. It concludes that no criminal investigation is warranted. The report is 3 pages long. It never mentions the enslaved population's uniform testimony. It never questions why a man who'd built execution equipment for years would suddenly make a fatal error. It never investigates whether the failure might have been engineered. 3 other plantation owners who'd attended the demonstration filed a joint statement supporting the coroner's findings. They had no interest in deeper investigation. They had their own plans to worry about, their own logistics of mass killing to finalize. Catherine Hale inherited the plantation. She was 32 years old, had no experience managing agricultural operations, and was devastated by her husband's death. Within a week, she'd announced plans to move to Charleston. The plantation would be sold. The enslaved workforce would be liquidated at auction. But before any of that could happen, Sherman's army arrived. Federal troops reached the Columbia area on November 15, 1864. They didn't come to Hale Grove specifically. The plantation was too small to warrant attention, but their presence in the region meant Confederate authority collapsed overnight. On November 17th, a Union lieutenant and 12 soldiers rode up the plantation drive. They'd received reports about Hale Grove from escaped slaves who described the hanging tree and the systematic violence. What they found was a property in chaos. Catherine Hale had departed 3 days earlier. Ketchum and the other overseers had fled, and 71 formerly enslaved people were still living in the quarters, uncertain what came next. The lieutenant, a man named Thomas Crawford from Pennsylvania, assembled everyone in the clearing near the quarters. The hanging tree stood visible behind him, its rope still in place. By authority of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the United States Army, Crawford announced. All persons held in slavery at this location are hereby and forever free. Silence. 71 people processing words they'd hoped for but barely believed would arrive. You're free to leave, Crawford continued. Free to stay. Free to make your own choices. The Army will provide assistance to anyone who needs it. Still silence. Then someone in the back started singing. An old hymn about crossing rivers and reaching promised lands. Others joined. The song built until all 71 voices were raised together, and Lieutenant Crawford stood watching with tears running down his face. Micah Freeman didn't sing. He stood with Hannah's hand in his, staring at the hanging tree, understanding that everything had changed and nothing had changed. Hale was dead, but the tree remained. The scaffold was destroyed, but the wood still bore witness to years of horror. That evening, after the soldiers had made camp and begun documenting the property, Micah approached Lieutenant Crawford. "Sir, I need to show you something." He led Crawford through the plantation, pointing out the marks he'd carved into wood over the years. Names and dates hidden in door frames and beams and posts. A record of everyone who died, documented in a language only Micah could fully read. "This is evidence," Crawford said quietly. "This matters." "Does it? The man responsible is dead. But the system that enabled him isn't. This documentation proves what happened here. It can help ensure it doesn't happen again." Micah wasn't convinced, but he showed Crawford everything. The hanging tree's branch with its stress marks. The scaffold's remains with the concealed rope still threaded through the post. The quarters with their scars and stories. And Crawford documented all of it. His report, filed with Union Command on November 22, 1864, describes Hale Grove as a site of systematic brutality and murder, with physical evidence suggesting at least 13 deaths by hanging over 2 years. The report never mentions that the last death was Jonathan Hale's, never suggests the scaffold malfunction might have been deliberate, but it preserves the names Micah carved into wood, ensuring that Thomas Freeman and the others wouldn't be completely erased from record. Some stories survive, some don't. What matters is that someone tried to remember. Chapter 12. The truth that 3 generations carried. Micah and Hannah Freeman left Hale Grove on November 25, 1864. They packed what little they owned, tools, clothing, memories, and walked away from the plantation where they'd spent their entire lives. They headed north toward Columbia, then eventually to Charleston, looking for work and safety in a world that was transforming faster than anyone could predict. They never spoke publicly about what happened on October 28th. To official inquiries, they maintained the story of accidental death. Even decades later, when interviewed by researchers documenting Reconstruction history, they described Jonathan Hale's death as a scaffold malfunction during a demonstration. But within their family, they told a different story. Micah and Hannah had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, born between 1866 and 1872 in Charleston, where Micah established himself as a respected carpenter. He built houses and churches, always refusing to construct anything involving rope or hanging mechanisms. He taught his son Samuel the craft of carpentry, passing along not just technical skills, but also the story of the scaffold, how it had been designed, how it had functioned, how physics could be understood and manipulated by someone patient enough to learn. Your grandfather, Micah told Samuel in 1883, built a machine that turned itself inside out. He did it because sometimes the only justice available is the kind you engineer yourself. Samuel Freeman passed that story to his own children, and they passed it to theirs. Through 4 generations, the truth about October 28, 1864, was preserved in oral tradition, while the official record remained unchanged. The historical documentation is sparse. The Richland County Courthouse records show Jonathan Hale's death as accidental. The plantation records were scattered when Catherine Hale sold the property. Lieutenant Crawford's report exists in Union Army archives, but it was never widely circulated or published. Most of what's known about Hale Grove comes from genealogical research conducted in the 1970s and 80s by historians documenting enslaved family histories. They interviewed descendants of the people who'd lived at the plantation. They collected oral histories, and they found consistent testimony about a carpenter named Micah Freeman who'd built a scaffold that killed its designer. But even these oral histories are careful. They frame events as stories passed down through the family rather than documented facts. They present the scaffold's failure as possible engineering rather than certain sabotage. They protect Micah Freeman even a century after his death, maintaining the fiction that saved him in 1864. Micah himself died in Charleston on March 3, 1904. He was 69 years old. His obituary in the Charleston News and Courier identifies him as a respected carpenter and freeman who established one of the city's first African-American-owned construction firms. It makes no mention of Hale Grove, no mention of the hanging tree, no mention of a scaffold that failed at exactly the right moment. Hannah Freeman survived him by 7 years, dying in 1911 at age 70. She was buried beside Micah in the Magnolia Cemetery, where their shared headstone bears only their names and dates. No epitaph, no story. But their descendants kept the story. Great-grandchildren told it to great-great-grandchildren. The specifics sometimes varied. Different people remembered different details, but the core remained consistent. Micah Freeman had studied violence until he understood it well enough to reverse it. In 1987, a historian named Dr. Patricia Morrison from the University of South Carolina conducted extensive interviews with Freeman family descendants for a project documenting Reconstruction-era resistance. She collected 6 different versions of the scaffold story, all consistent in their essential details. Dr. Morrison's findings were published in a limited circulation academic journal. She concluded that while definitive proof was impossible, the convergence of oral history, physical evidence from the scaffold's remains, and suspicious timing of the equipment failure suggested a high probability of deliberate engineering. Her work drew criticism from some historians who argued that she was romanticizing violent resistance. Others defended her methodology, noting that enslaved people's agency and resistance had been systematically erased from official records, making oral history one of the few ways to recover those stories. The debate continues, but the Freeman family knows what happened. They've always known. History gets written by those who survive to do the writing. Sometimes that means truth lives in kitchens instead of courthouses. The 71 people who witnessed Jonathan Hale's death scattered after emancipation. Some left immediately, heading north or toward coastal cities where opportunities seemed more promising. Others stayed in the region, taking work on reconstructed plantations for wages that were barely better than what slavery had provided. The ones who stayed faced immediate danger. White resistance to Reconstruction manifested as organized violence. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan targeted formerly enslaved people who testified against former masters, who registered to vote, who tried to exercise their new legal rights. Ketchum, the overseer, survived the war and remained in the region. He opened a general store in Columbia and quietly spread the word that he knew what had happened at Hale Grove. He couldn't prove anything, but he let people know he suspected Micah Freeman had engineered Hale's death. That suspicion made Micah's position in Charleston tenuous. Even years after emancipation, killing a white man, even a white man as brutal as Jonathan Hale, remained the ultimate crime in the South. Micah lived under the shadow of potential prosecution until Ketchum's death in 1878. Joshua and Daniel, the two men scheduled to hang on October 28th, both survived. Joshua moved to Philadelphia, where he found work as a dock laborer and lived until 1902. Daniel stayed in South Carolina working as a blacksmith. He died in 1896. Before his death, Daniel gave an interview to a black newspaper in Columbia. He spoke carefully about the demonstration, describing it as a day when God's judgment reversed itself. He never explicitly stated that the scaffold failure was engineered, but he made clear that he considered Micah Freeman a man who understood that knowledge itself could be freedom. The three plantation owners who'd attended the demonstration and later filed statements supporting the accidental death ruling all survived the war. They adapted to Reconstruction with varying degrees of success, transitioning from slave labor to sharecropping arrangements that weren't fundamentally different in practice. None of them faced prosecution for the planned mass killings. The conspiracy was never officially documented. It existed only in the memories of those who'd overheard the planning, and those witnesses had no legal standing to testify during Reconstruction. The federal government focused on rebuilding infrastructure and establishing basic civil rights, not investigating crimes that hadn't quite happened yet. The hanging tree itself stood at Hale Grove for another 40 years. The property changed hands multiple times. It was worked by sharecroppers in the 1870s and 80s, parceled out to smaller farms in the 1890s, and eventually abandoned when the soil finally gave out completely in the early 1900s. The tree died sometime around 1920, killed by disease and age. It fell during a storm in 1923. By then, the few people who remembered its original purpose were elderly, and the specific horrors it represented had been replaced by new horrors. Lynchings throughout the South that echoed the plantation violence in systematically terrorizing black communities. A researcher visited the site in 1976, following Dr. Morrison's work, trying to locate physical evidence. She found the tree's remains rotted into the soil. She found no trace of the scaffold or quarters. But she did find, buried under decades of sediment, a piece of carved wood with initials cut into it. T.F. Thomas Freeman. That fragment is now preserved in the Charleston Museum's collection of artifacts from enslaved communities. It's labeled Carved Wood Fragment, Hale Grove Plantation, Collier 1863-64, purpose unknown. The Freeman descendants know the purpose. It's one of the markers Micah carved to document the dead. Physical evidence that someone tried to remember when the official record worked to forget. Artifacts survive when stories don't. Sometimes the wood speaks louder than paper. The story of the scaffold refuses to stay buried. It surfaces periodically, passed through different communities, interpreted through different lenses. In the 1920s and 30s, during the Harlem Renaissance, writers like Zora Neale Hurston collected folk tales from the South, including stories about enslaved people who used their skills to resist. Hurston recorded a version of the Hale Grove story in her field notes, though she never published it. The version she heard emphasized Micah's patience, how he'd studied for 18 months before acting, how he'd saved some people while letting others die, how he'd lived with impossible moral calculations. Civil rights activists in the 1960s rediscovered the story through oral history projects. It became a teaching tool about resistance, about using the oppressor's tools against them. about the importance of skill and knowledge as forms of power. Some historians have questioned whether the story happened as described. They note the lack of contemporary documentation beyond Crawford's report. They point out that oral histories can be embellished over generations. They argue that while something clearly happened at Hale Grove on October 28, 1864, the specific claim that Micah engineered the scaffold failure might be family mythology rather than historical fact. But the Freeman family has maintained consistent testimony for 5 generations. And physical evidence, the scaffold's remains, Crawford's report, the carved markers Micah left throughout the plantation, supports the core narrative. In 2003, the site where Hale Grove once stood was designated a historical marker by the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. The marker reads, Hale Grove Plantation, Sequoia 1840-1865, site of cotton cultivation using enslaved labor. Significant for documentation of resistance activities during final years of slavery, property abandoned post-Reconstruction. It doesn't mention the hanging tree, doesn't mention Jonathan Hale's death, doesn't mention Micah Freeman by name. The official commemoration is as sanitized as the original coroner's report. But local tour guides who lead groups through Civil War and Reconstruction sites tell the fuller story. They point out where the tree stood. They describe the scaffold demonstration. They talk about a carpenter who understood physics well enough to reverse the machinery of death. And they always end with a question. What would you do if the only justice available was the kind you had to build yourself? The Freeman family descendants still live in Charleston and throughout South Carolina. Some are aware of their connection to Micah. Others have lost the thread of family history through the disruptions of Jim Crow, the Great Migration, and the general erasure of Black historical memory that American society has systematically enforced. But those who know the story carry it carefully. They understand that it's not a simple tale of heroic resistance. It's a story about impossible choices, about the cost of violence even when that violence is justified, about living with decisions that save some people while abandoning others. Micah Freeman was never a hero in the conventional sense. He was a man who developed a terrible skill and used it to save what lives he could while being forced to sacrifice others. He was a carpenter who learned to manipulate death itself and who carried the weight of that knowledge until his own death 40 years later. The scaffold he built existed for one day, but its legacy, the idea that oppressed people can study their oppression carefully enough to dismantle it, that patience and knowledge can become weapons, that even in the most total systems of control, there are always tiny spaces where resistance is possible. That legacy continues. The official record says Jonathan Hale died in an accident. The Freeman family knows better. Sometimes in Charleston, when descendants gather for reunions or funerals, someone will tell the story again. How great-great-grandfather Micah spent 18 months studying a hanging tree. How he learned the physics of rope and wood and weight. How he built a machine that looked like execution equipment, but functioned as a reversal mechanism. How he waited for exactly the right moment and pulled exactly the right rope. And how he lived with that choice for 40 years, never certain if it had been worth the cost. The tree is gone. The scaffold is gone. Even the plantation itself exists only as overgrown foundation stones in a forest no one visits. But the story remains, passed down through generations. A reminder that knowledge itself can be resistance. That sometimes the only way to survive a system designed to kill you is to understand that system better than the people who built it. That patience and precision can accomplish what rebellion and violence cannot. And that justice, when it comes at all, often arrives disguised as accident, engineered by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, but could never afford to admit it. The last known photograph of Micah Freeman was taken in 1900, 4 years before his death. He sits outside his Charleston carpentry shop, tools arranged beside him, his hands resting on his knees. His expression is unreadable, neither proud nor ashamed, neither haunted nor peaceful, just present, still carrying whatever weight October 28, 1864, had placed on him. But if you look closely at the photograph, you can see something carved into the doorframe behind him. 2 letters, almost invisible in the shadow. T.F. Thomas Freeman, his brother, still remembered, still witnessed, still there in the wood, where Micah had always known to put the things that mattered most. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.